Welcome to the Spirit Room. This podcast is a gathering place for people in search of personal growth and life's higher meaning. I'm your host, Mike Consul. I also invite you to spend time on the Spirit Room website, where you'll find headlines about religion, spirituality, psychology, and the New Age movement. Just go to thespiritroom.org. The year was 1977. I was a junior in high school. My brother Jim, who is going to join me on this podcast, he's online via phone, and he was a sophomore at the time. We both experienced what, to this day, may very well be the biggest trauma of our lives. There was a winter night. A couple of police officers showed up at the door, and my parents were informed that our eldest sibling, we're two of 7 children, but our eldest sibling, our brother Anthony, had committed suicide. And just to give you a little, against this backdrop, not only was he our oldest brother, but he graduated as valedictorian in his high school. He had gone to Stevens Institute of Technology. Brilliant guy. Was studying computer science. And so it was a tremendous trauma, naturally. And as I said, my brother Jim joins me by phone. Jim, what do you remember from that experience? Just kind of the initial delivery of the news.
Well, it was, of course, as shocking as anything in my life. And I just remember Dad just grabbing me and saying, "Your brother is dead." Of course, he was hysterical with grief. And Mom was sitting on a chair, and she was kind of delirious with grief. And I grabbed her by the hand and tried to console her. I don't even quite remember what words I was using, and then Dad, and then I have another scene that I recall. It probably was just within the first 30 or 60 minutes after I got home. Dad was just stomping his foot on the floor. He had some difficulty dealing with the fact that Tony had left that day before, and he wanted to go after him, and he did go after him in the car, but he couldn't find him, so I'm sure he was just cycling through all kinds of thoughts and misery for sure. So that's my first impressions, or my first recollections.
Well, Anthony was living in upstate New York City at the time, and he came to visit for just a couple days. We didn't know he was actually just saying goodbye. And then, as you say, when he left the house, had said goodbye actually to Mom. And when Dad got home shortly thereafter, Mom told him he had left, and it had only been a few minutes. And he, as you say, couldn't find him. Got in the car, drove down the street, and just couldn't find him. But the other thing I remember is that, of course, tremendous amount of guilt Mom and Dad heaped on themselves, just the feeling that they had done something wrong, which I think is probably a natural parental instinct in a situation like that. But then the aftermath of it, and something that we've talked about over the years, is how, because Anthony was considerably older than us, and obviously he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and then we were left to wonder if we had a latent schizophrenia gene in our system that hadn't expressed itself yet. So you and I ended up kind of waiting over time and wondering, is something going to express itself? Are we going to kind of go down this same path? It was kind of a terrifying way to be going through the rest of our high school years and then into college.
I do remember having a lot of thoughts about exactly that, just thinking like, what's the potential for one of us for this to develop, and I really did plunge into a deep depression and just a lot of anxiety, and that was about 6 months after his death, and so I was, and part of that, it was a mix of all kinds of things, but certainly there were some elements to that that just felt like, I'm going to plunge into, this thing is just going to advance into some kind of psychotic episode, and I was just going to, my life would sort of unfold in a similar fashion. That because the depression and the anxiety I was feeling, almost there's just no way I was going to be able to live like that for a long time, and I just felt like there was some real potential in my own life to just become so agonized that life just wouldn't be worth living anymore.
Well, as part of your depression, and I had some of my own depression along the way, although not nearly as severe as yours. I know that you did a lot of study into the psychology of these situations, and you came to believe that Anthony had been misdiagnosed. He wasn't really a schizophrenic. Your own study just led you to the conclusion that something else was going on. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I was really consumed by it for quite a while, and so I did some research. It's true, and at that time period, and I guess this is typical of any. As time goes along, there's periods when certain, let's say, in psychology, for instance, it seemed like at the time schizophrenia was diagnosed frequently for many different conditions, I found out, and so that's why, and I researched a little more, and I found that he really didn't, from my perspective, he didn't elicit any of the hallmarks of schizophrenia, and he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. He never, ever talked about hearing voices or thinking the government was plotting against him, or that any of those type of paranoid fantasies. None of that was really going on, from what I could tell. And also, I read a letter from the doctor.
This would be Dr. Rose. Was this Dr. Rose?
Dr. Rose.
And let me just interject. Let me just interject. The Dr. Rose did what actually has since been discredited. I believe it was called primal scream therapy, and I'll let you talk about that a little bit later. But go ahead. So you're reading a letter from Tony's doctor, Dr. Rose, that's told you what?
Well, he was just basically saying that he felt people were staring at him, and he felt like I remember that specifically. There's a little more to it, but nothing that sort of jumped out at me that maybe a normal person wouldn't feel. And some people thinking people are staring at you. I mean, people can be self-conscious, especially when you're in that state of mind. You may feel like people are recognize that you are in some state of torment. And also, and I'm not saying he never maybe had a psychotic episode, but certainly anybody who has extreme depression can have a psychotic episode. They shouldn't be diagnosed schizophrenic necessarily, but so I just feel that, and even his behavior when he was home for those 2 days before he left and committed suicide, he was certainly agitated. He was uncomfortable, and he was exhibiting a lot of anxiety and discomfort. But nothing that I ever saw or known over the years or read made me think that he was schizophrenic.
I'm kind of assuming that even though you came to the conclusion that he wasn't schizophrenic, that it was severe depression, that didn't really give you any relief in terms of the terror of whether or not it would express itself in you or me or any other of our brothers and sisters. I mean, I think I said at the top, of family of 7 children. That I'm assuming it didn't really give you any relief. It was just a conclusion you had come to at the time.
Yeah, it didn't necessarily give me any relief, I don't think. But of course, I'm saying this from the sidelines. obviously he was in therapy over the years with this Dr. Rose for one, and then in some other therapy before that, I believe. So I wasn't privy to all those conversations and everything, so I don't know for certain, but from where I'm coming from, I didn't really see it.
So he was going through primal scream therapy. I mean, he had tried several things. He had gone. This was the Vietnam era, and he knew he was going to get drafted. So he decided, well, I'll pick my own branch since I know the draft is going to come get me. I will pick the Air Force. He ends up at an Air Force base in Bitburg, Germany, maybe among some other places. And he ends up going AWOL because the schizophrenia, the depression, whatever it was really starting to express itself. He even experimented with LSD based on the reading he had done, teachings of Timothy Leary. And that's the kind of guy he was, very intellectual, would study subjects and then attempt. Obviously, it didn't work. He ends up eventually in primal therapy, primal scream therapy. Very simply put, we have these traumas in our lives, according to primal scream therapy, including the birth process, and we re-experience those and let out a blood-curdling scream, basically. And as I said, I believe that I wanted just to get your impressions on this because I think you've probably done more reading on it than I have, Jim. I believe that this today, primal scream therapy is basically not used at all. And what I had heard at the time was that it was the worst possible thing to really use with, if Anthony was indeed schizophrenic, it was the worst sort of therapy to be using.
Yes. Well, that's true. And not only that, but it was, this Dr. Rose was, from what I could tell, was performing his own form of primal scream therapy. It wasn't because the Primal Institute was on the West Coast. I guess it was in Los Angeles at the time, and I don't know if it's still around or not. And I think you're right; it's been mostly discredited or just gone so far out of favor that it may not even exist anymore. But I also did read that too, that primal therapy was not indicated for his for schizophrenia. I still remember also when I'm not sure if you were in the car or not, Mike. Do you remember driving to New York City to take him to drop him off for the therapy? Do you remember? Were you there?
I don't think I made that particular trip. I have no recollection of it, so I think I actually had stayed home on that one.
Yeah, that was kind of difficult to watch too. He was very nervous, of course, and I think he felt like, okay, well, here's an important, he had a lot of hopes, and there was probably a lot of anxiety about, in anticipation about getting into therapy. And not only that, but even to start the therapy, they use stressors like to build up tension and such, like they leave you in, can't remember exactly, but they use some forms of deprivation to start with, thinking that would help with the therapy in the beginning. So
it would precipitate a sort of trauma or kind of help you dive into
experience.
Say that again?
Yeah, like a primal experience. You try to get to that primal, some of those primal wounds, I guess, is the thinking.
So some isolation, it sounds like maybe sitting alone in a room and having to kind of wrestle with your own demons.
Right, yeah.
So the thing is that I think at the time Anthony was figuring this is kind of my last hope. Now, I should say that he was given medication at one point. Now, the medication... Nowadays, medication is so much more advanced than it was then. There are really effective drugs and cocktails of drugs for people who are suffering from virtually any form of mental illness. But at that time, the one that he was taking, or the couple that they tried with him, I remember him not liking it, saying it made him groggy, and he just decided, I'm just not going to take those drugs. He had no interest in living on drugs, but I'm sure he would have done so if he felt that it was offering real relief. It certainly is a better option than being so desperately unhappy that you would commit suicide.
Yeah. Yeah, that's there's so many things that or you could reflect on, and I have reflected on it, thinking like, geez, just if this had happened a little differently, the outcome may have been much different. And that's one of them too. Is like if he had just maybe allowed the medication to, because it takes several weeks for antidepressants to take hold. If he had been willing to fight through some of the original side effects, then maybe he would have found some relief. And another one too was, and this was a big one, was when he was going to go to the Menninger clinic in, I believe it was Kansas City, where they were having, it was one of the clinics in the country that was working a lot with schizophrenics. And Dad was going to drive him out there. And that's when he came home, and apparently they had talked, Tony and Dad had talked about him going to the Menninger clinic. And apparently he decided that he didn't even want to do that, and he left that day, and that was the end. And I can't help but thinking if he did make that trip, possibly they would have recognized that maybe he wasn't schizophrenic, or they would apply a different type of therapy, or he would have found some hope out there, and it could have changed everything from there, of course, potentially, but who knows?
Yeah, I think he certainly would have got more advanced treatment there than he had received to date, because the Menninger Clinic, it's a big name clinic in that area, in the area of mental health. So it's a good point that he could have. That could have been a turning point that he decided to not even avail himself of it. I think he did reach the point where he truly had given up and didn't really feel like he had any options. Obviously, he felt like he had to give up, because he did. So now the outcome of this story is that you and I never did end up having certain genes express themselves in a way that devastated us with depression. You went through the bout you were talking about in the aftermath of Anthony's suicide, and I've certainly had my experiences with it, and had certainly anxiety over the years, but nothing on the scale that we had feared.
Yeah, we were fortunate in that regard, from the fear that we were living with at that period. That because at that time, of course, not as much was known, and but if I remember right, I think the ages between 18 and 40, I guess, is when it tends to express itself, schizophrenia, if it is going to. And obviously that didn't happen, so.
Yeah, that actually, I kept that really in mind as I got older, and I passed certain milestones. I realized that I think you and I are okay. We're in the safe zone now. We're past those years. It's not that it couldn't still happen, but as you say, there's real questions whether Anthony really was actually schizophrenic, and even if he was, so far we've certainly dodged that bullet.
Yes.
So tough subject.
And it is a tough subject, and it's changed the course of certainly my life, I feel, and all of our lives to a degree.
The reason I wanted to kind of talk through this, is I think we hit on a couple things here that are important for people to think about, people who might be suffering with some form of mental illness or depression of some sort. And one is to give the drugs a chance if it's come to that point. Another is that to not give up hope when there's other treatments available. Certainly Anthony could have benefited, I think, from some drug therapy, even though at the time the drugs weren't as advanced. I wish he had gone to the Menninger Clinic. Perhaps he'd be alive today, who knows. And oftentimes, the thing I think to remember is if anybody's feeling depression is that one of the scourges of depression is that you start to feel like you run out of options, that you don't have any hope, and you really need an advocate, somebody around you who's kind of an advocate, who's going to always be there to help navigate you through it and point to other options that are available, that there is hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Just going back to, and I thought of this as you were just saying that, was part of the isolation that Tony was going through too was, I think it's important for anybody dealing with depression to try to stay engaged with people as much as possible, even if it is uncomfortable. And because I think, and of course, Dr. Rose with Tony wanted him to cut off contact with the family, and he encouraged him to basically isolate himself, which I think also exacerbated his condition, whatever it was, whether it was schizophrenia or depression or whatever. So it's just sad that there's just so many pieces in there that happened that wrote the story in a bad way, unfortunately.
That's a good point, that isolation, and that actually contributed to the pain that I think we felt as well, because he had distanced himself from the family, basically cut himself off from the family. He would come and visit once in a great while, and I think it did him a lot of harm, that isolation. And then we ended up feeling as though we had somehow been rejected. People tend to isolate when they get depressed. Tony, not only, he was encouraged to isolate, as you say, by that doctor, and I think it was a terrible thing. The other thing I'd point out is that came back to me is that Anthony went through several periods where he was doing a lot better. He would call and he sounded good. He was going out to New York Ranger games and New York Knicks games, and I don't think he was really socializing a whole lot, but he had sounded much better. He sounded like he was on the comeback trail, and then he would slump again. So we had seen or heard episodes where he was doing much better, and it was really encouraging to Mom and Dad and all of us. And then all of a sudden it would be back to a phone call that sounded like it was a man who was kind of the Walking Dead.
Yeah, I remember those phone calls. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, he was even driving a cab in New York City for a while for work.
That's right. I forgot about that.
And then, but the calls were awful when, in the middle of the night or something, he would call and just say he's going to jump out of the window or he can't. The pain became too great, and Mom and Dad would get ready to jump in the car, and then he would call back 5 minutes later and said, "No, don't come." And it was just an awful roller coaster for certainly Mom and Dad and the family, and of course for Tony as well.
It was that. It was definitely a roller coaster, a really horrifying one. So it's a long look back. As I said at the top, 1977 was the year it happened, but boy, it has lived a long afterlife. And we, as we described, thinking back on it, and just the elements of concern that we went through for our own welfare and our other siblings. That's it for this episode of The Spirit Room. Thanks for listening. Godspeed.